Faculty of Economics and Management, University Putra, Malaysia. I greet you by the Muslim salutation of Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace be upon us. And it is with a great honor, my name is Yoshia Christian, and I will be your master ceremony in this second day of plenary session of this conference. And we are very glad to welcome you, to see all the participants, and appreciate all of you to take your effort and time in joining this conference. We have had the interesting and successful the first day of the conference yesterday, so we hope that this day will be a memorable conference for all of us. And for your information, there are more than 350 papers for more than 12 countries are gathering now in Bali to not only experience the beautiful Bali as the paradise island, but also to join this international conference. So I think we deserve to have a big round of applause for us. Thank you. And excellencies, distinguished participants, and ladies and gentlemen, let us proceed to the next agenda. In today's plenary session, we will have 3 keynote speeches delivered by 3 professors that are master in their field. And we'll proceed to the first keynote speech. The first keynote speech will be delivered by the professor from University of New South Wales, Australia. She is the professor of finance at University of New South Wales, Australia, who hold master in mathematics from Stanford University and PhD in economics from University of Chicago, USA. Her research interest is in the organization of corporate boards. So I would like to invite Professor Rini Adams to deliver the material.
To Indonesia before, so it's really exciting, and also exciting to see some of my good friends here, Iftikhar and Koos, and meet new friends. All right, so when Iftikhar asked me if I could do a keynote, I was sort of thinking what I should do, and then you know, it's a bit of a challenge because this is a conference on finance, banking, financial stability, business, economics, and social sciences. So it's a pretty broad topic, so I thought, well, the obvious thing to do is to talk about women, because I figured that talking about women would appeal to both the women and the men. I know some men who are also interested in women, regardless of your topic of interest. So I'm going to give a talk about called Women on Boards, the Superheroes of Tomorrow, and this combines 2 of my interests. So first, I'm interested in women. And second, I'm interested in superheroes. So my son, who is with me, tells me that he's the kid at school who knows the most about superheroes. So superheroes is a big topic in our household. And I should point out I'm moving. I'm not going to be at University of New South Wales much longer. I'll be at Oxford as of September 1st. So if you want to contact me, please email me at Oxford. Okay. So what I'm going to start out with is to try to convince you, or in this whole talk, what I'm going to try to convince you is that we need to do much more research on women and gender in particular. And one reason why we need more research is because there's so much policy activity in this space. Okay, so what I have on this graph is the number and percentage of countries enacting boardroom gender policies. So what are boardroom gender policies? Some countries have quotas. So for example, Norway has a 40% quota for women on boards. Some countries have disclosure rules. So Australia, New Zealand, you have to disclose what the diversity of your board is. Some countries have quotas for state-owned companies only. And some countries have corporate governance codes that specifically require the board to consider gender as a factor in nominating new directors. So it's not actually a quota, but there's a recommendation that directors should consider gender. And so what I have here is, let me see if I can get this laser to work. Which one was the laser again? Oh, over here, there, okay. It's good if you can see. Okay, so what I have here, the bold line here is the number of policies. So these are the number of countries and number of policies that have been enacted. So you see there's a lot of activity going on in recent years, okay? And this dotted line is the percent of countries that have some sort of board gender policy. So you see that this ends in 2016, almost 25% of the world's countries have some sort of board gender policy. Okay, so this is a hot policy topic, very important. So what do we know about gender? Seems like, well, we should know a lot. So let me go to this next slide. What I did here to figure out, well, how much do we actually know about the topic of gender and board diversity? The answer is not much. So what I did here is I replicated this dashed line here is a replication of the number of policies that have been enacted from the previous slide that I showed you here. So it's just this one. That's this one. Okay, it looks a bit different, but it's the same line. And then what I have down here is the number of papers that have been published in finance journals or journals that are known for publishing papers on boards. So papers that, journals that publish governance papers. So it's roughly 13 journals. And what I did is I went through and I said, well, how many papers have been published on board diversity? Okay. So here's the number. So it's basically 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Here's 1. It goes back to 0. Here's 1, 0, 0, 1. And then here, there's a little bit of a trend upwards. Okay. Now, basically, what does that tell you? There hasn't been much published on gender, right? And for those of you who are interested in informed policy making, it should worry you that all the policy making is happening before the papers have been published, the academic papers have been written, right? So it's not that the academic literature comes first and then we know what the role of board gender diversity is and then we implement a policy. That's not how it's working. What's happening is that the policymakers are making the policies and then the academics are trying to study what's going on, okay? Which, you know, from an academic perspective is sometimes a bit scary, right? But basically the point is that really there's not much research out there and we should all be sort of trying to figure out what's going on because we need to inform policy, right? So there's still a chance to reshape policy if it needs to be reshaped. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is 3 questions. So first, do we know what the facts are concerning the representation of women on boards? So I showed you there's all this policy, right? So everyone is saying, oh, there's not enough women, there's not enough women. So do we even know what the facts are? Okay. And second, I'm going to ask, is there a business case for diversity? So I'll tell you a bit later that you know, one reason why these policies are enacted is because policymakers think that if you add more women to the board, shareholder value increases magically. So is that true? That's what I'm going to talk about. And the third question is, why is the answer to the second question not obvious? Okay. Okay, so first, I'm going to provide you some context. Okay, so I started out, my talk is called Women on Boards, the Superheroes of Tomorrow, and I had this opening spiel about, oh, we like superheroes. So why the superhero motif in this context? So let me give you the reason. So let me first read this quote to you, and this comes from the European Commission, one of the European Commission policy documents. So in Europe, there's now a proposal on the table to have a 40% gender target. So it's not a quota, but it's a target. This comes from the policy document that recommends this target. So it says, indeed, there is a clear business case for greater gender diversity on corporate boards, both from the microeconomic perspective, i.e. in terms of individual companies' performance, as well as from a macroeconomic perspective, i.e. in terms of higher sustainable rates of economic growth. Sorry, I'm just realizing that there's a disconnect between what's there and there. Okay. So what are the microeconomic benefits that women on boards are supposed to bring? So first, improved company performance, mirroring the market, enhanced quality of decision making, improved corporate governance and ethics, and better use of the talent pool. And the macroeconomic benefits are that if you have more women on boards, it creates incentives for women to stay in the workplace, thereby helping to achieve stronger economies, and it can help countries achieve higher sustainable rates of economic growth. Okay, so I look at these and I'm like, well, you know, women have to be superheroes, right? Because not only are they going to save the companies, improve the decision making, improve the ethics, but you have more women on boards and the whole country is going to grow at a faster rate, right? I mean, you've got to be a superhero in order to accomplish this. So can female directors save the world, which is basically what the European Commission is saying? And my answer is sure, right? Of course, right? Women can do it all. But maybe the conditions have to be right? And so let's try and understand what the conditions are. Now, is it easy to figure out the conditions? And the answer is no, it is not. Why? As I'm going to try to tell you now, we need better data. Okay? As an empirical economist, it always starts with the data, right? Data is fundamental. And we need better methods. Causal inference is a big deal in this setting. And what are the problems? The standard ones: omitted variables, reverse causality, and selection. Okay, so there's a lot of empirical challenges. As a result of the empirical challenges, footnotes that correlation does not prove or imply causation do not cut it. Okay, so I'll get back to where that footnote comes from. But you can no longer footnote, you know, you can't show a correlation and then have a footnote saying, well, you know, I'm not claiming causality, right? Since when can you put that in a footnote? Well, some people apparently think that you can, as I'll show you later. Okay, so let me start with the data, right? So do we even know what the facts are? Now, many people claim to know what the facts are. There's many surveys of women on boards. Now, one thing that you may or may not know, or most people don't even pay attention or notice, turns out all of these surveys focus on very large firms. Okay? And all of these surveys focus on the proportion or fraction of women on the board. So how do you measure board diversity? You count the number of directors on the board. You count the number of women on the board, you take the number of women divided by the number of directors. Okay, so that's how people measure diversity, and you do this at the firm level, and then you average across firms, and that's a measure of diversity in a country, for example. Now, is this the right measure? Where's the debate on this? We don't know, right? So why do we do it? Well, because everyone else does it, right? So we measure diversity the same way that everyone measures it. What I'm going to show you is, well, maybe it's not exactly the right measure, or one could also come up with other measures. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of these surveys that are out there in the literature, and I'm going to benchmark it using some of my own data from some of my own research. So the sample that I'm going to use to look at what's the representation of women is BoardX data on unregulated firms in 24 OECD countries from 2001 to 2016. And what we do with the sample is we try to make sure that the sample is representative of the country. Okay, so you may or may not know the BoardX data, but there's a lot of sort of international data sets that claim to cover companies in many countries, but when you look at it, sometimes there's only 3 or 4 companies in a country, right? So it's not really representative for that country. So what we're going to try to do, we make sure that the data can be considered to be representative of a country by requiring that at least 70% of market cap is covered in Bordex. Okay. Now we're going to take our data and we're going to compare to some of the surveys that are out there that people use to inform the policy debate. So the first survey is a very, very well-known survey by Catalyst. Okay, so Catalyst might be sort of like the originator of these board diversity surveys, very influential in the policy debate. I think pretty much every policy document in this sphere has cited Catalyst. Okay. Now, what is the data on Catalyst? They collect data on boards of Fortune 500 companies in the US. Okay? The next database I'm going to benchmark our data to is the European Union's Gender Balance in Decision-Making database. Now, what is this? This is the database that the European Union uses to sort of justify policy intervention and to monitor progress towards achieving the goals. And basically what they do is they go to each country in the EU, they take the top 50 companies in terms of in the major index and figure out what the diversity is. Okay. Now some countries don't have 50 companies in their main index, like Germany, for example, has the DAX 30. So in that case, there's only 30 companies that they calculate diversity for. And then I'm also going to benchmark against Credit Suisse. So Credit Suisse, what they do is they look at 3,400 companies, and in order to enter into the survey, the company has to have analyst coverage by Credit Suisse. Okay. Now, here's the first comparison. So what we have here, this is Fortune 500 firms, right? So diversity, so you just count, the fraction of women on the board, and then you average across all Fortune 500 companies in the US, right? So this is the Catalyst data, and basically it goes from, what, about 12% to 20% according to Catalyst. So significant improvement in gender diversity, one would argue. Now here's our data, okay? So you see that our data is, there's also an upward trend, but there's a significant difference between the Catalyst data and our data. We estimate almost half, right? So diversity is roughly 50% of what Catalyst estimates. So that's a bit worrying, right? So who's right? Okay, of course we are, but I'll explain why in a second. Okay, so here's the comparison to the EU data. So here's what the EU estimates is the diversity in 16 European Union countries. And you see, again, there's a big increase in diversity over time, and also roughly about 25% diversity in 2016. So this green line, this is our number, okay? So now you see that not only is diversity lower, and by a significant amount, but also the growth rate is lower, okay? Let me just pick one country out of the EU. Well, whether or not it's EU anymore, well, we'll find out. So here is, sorry, I pressed the wrong. Okay, so here's what the European Union estimates is diversity in the UK, and here's what we estimate is diversity in the UK. So again, you see there's a significant gap. According to the European Union, in the UK, gender diversity is roughly 25%. In 2015, we estimate it's maybe around 12%. So again, roughly half, right? So it doesn't look so good anymore. Here's Japan. Japan has very low board diversity. So here's Credit Suisse numbers for Japan. Very low board diversity, 3.5%. So much lower than in the UK and European Union. Even though the numbers are very small, we still estimate, so these are our numbers, we estimate that diversity is even lower, okay? So regardless of the country you pick, we always estimate lower numbers for diversity. So how's that possible? So what explains the difference? The difference is explained by the sample size and the types of firms, okay? So here, for example, is the number of firms that enter into the European Union survey. Okay, so it's about, here this is 500. So initially they had more firms, and then in recent years they basically have 500 firms entering into their survey every year, right? This right here is the number of firms that we have entering into our data. So we calculate the numbers for a much broader set of firms, okay? And what's a key distinguishing feature between the set of firms that we look at and the set of firms that the European Union looks at? Well, these are all really large firms, right? Because they focus on the largest firms in each country, and we have a much bigger set. So we have the large firms, but we also have smaller firms. Okay, so we really have a lot of firms. You see this right here, that's 3,000, right? So we have roughly 3,000 firms for the EU as compared to 500 for the EU. Okay, so what explains the difference? Well, the Catalyst survey, right? They only look at Fortune 500 companies. Fortune 500 are the largest firms in the US. We look at, when we calculate our numbers for diversity, we look at between 1,700 and 4,500 US firms. Okay? The EU is for at most 50 large firms in each country, and generally less than 500 a year, as I showed you. Our sample, we have between 600 and 1,700 firms for the UK alone. Okay. Credit Suisse requires analyst coverage, which also means they're large firms, right? Because you have to be a large firm to have analyst coverage. And they look at only 3,400 companies globally, while we have more than that in our sample for the US alone. Okay. So what's one of the lessons? Women are much more likely to sit on the boards of large firms. Okay. So if you're measuring diversity by only looking at the large firms, you're actually overstating how many women are represented, right? Now, here's the problem. If you look at the large firms and you say, well, women are really underrepresented on boards, actually, you're overstating the problem, right? So women are much less represented than people think they are because they're not even looking at the small firms, right? So the problem is much bigger than people say it is. So the representation of women is actually much worse than all of these surveys convey. Okay, so if you think there's a problem based on these surveys, well, based on our numbers, you've really got to worry, right? So we've got to go out and do some research, right? So what is going on here, right? And even with the policies in place, the progress towards increasing board diversity is much slower than people say it is, okay? Because they're only looking at the large firms. So this is a big issue. Okay, so now I'm going to argue that maybe even it's not even the problem that people are looking at the large firms versus the small firms, but there may be other reasons to think that the problem may be much worse than people say it is. And the reason comes with how we measure diversity. Okay? So what we do is we focus on the % women on board, but this measure does not necessarily capture new entry of women into the director pool. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to propose a new measure, which is, I call it director participation. And why do I call it director participation? Because it's like labor force participation, right? So if you want to measure what's the fraction of the workforce that's female, right, labor force participation, what you do is you count the people who are in the population, and you say what proportion of the population is a working woman, right? So there's different ways of doing it, or you count the number of people who are working, and then you say what proportion of the number of people who are working is female. Okay, so now what's a key characteristic of this type of measure is you don't double count individuals, right? So every individual enters into these measures once, okay? So if you have 2 jobs, 4 jobs, doesn't matter, okay? Now, the diversity measures, they actually double count individuals. So this is a problem. So let me show you exactly how this works. So here what I have is I have 2 boards. So this board has 5 people, 4 men, 1 woman. And here I have another board. This board has 4 people, 3 men, 1 woman. Now, the way that the generic census of women on boards works is what you do is you say, well, what's diversity on this board? It's 1/5, right? 1 woman divided by 5 directors. So it's 0.2. Here we have 1 divided by 4, it's 0.25. So average diversity, you add this plus this, and then you divide by 2, right? So this is how all these measures are calculated. Okay, so now there's 2 possibilities here. We could have that the men are different, or it's not the only possibilities, but I'll just highlight these 2. So suppose the men are all different and the women are also different. So this woman is not the same as this woman, right? So each board has a unique woman. They also have unique men. Now, nothing changes in the calculation of diversity, right? So diversity is still 1/5, 1/4. Average diversity is 0.225. Now, suppose we use my measure, which I propose, which is participation. So what is participation? Is you count the number of unique directors, and you say what proportion of the number of unique directors is female. Okay, so we have how many unique directors here? We have 9 unique directors, and 2 of those are unique, and they're female. So participation is 2 divided by 9. So we get 0.222, which is roughly the same as average diversity. Okay, that's fine. Now suppose we have this situation. So the men are all different, but the women are the same, right? So this woman sits on this board, but she also sits on the other board. Okay, nothing changes with diversity, right? So we still have 1/5, 1/4. Average diversity is 0.225. Now what about participation? Okay, so now we have 8 unique directors, 1 of whom is female. So participation is 1/8, which is 0.125, which is almost half of average diversity. Okay. So what happens here is what you see is that diversity does not take account of double counting, right? So if the same woman sits on every board, diversity may look very high, but participation is very low, right? So you could be increasing diversity like crazy by having the same woman sitting everywhere, but then is this actually what we're aiming for when we talk about diversity, increased diversity? Do we want each firm to have the same woman, or do we want more women serving as directors? These are different questions, right? So you need different measures to answer these questions. So basically, the measures that we use don't actually reflect accurately the facts that we want to know. And it may be that the representation of women is much worse than people say it is because we are actually double counting all the women. Okay, so basically, you know, the problem is bigger than we think it is. Now, is there a case for diversity? And in particular, is there a business case for diversity? What does a business case mean? It means that when you add women to the board, shareholder value increases. And so the European Commission says that there is. Let me read you this again. They say, indeed, there's a clear business case for greater gender diversity on corporate boards, both from the microeconomic perspective, i.e. in terms of individual companies' performance, as well as from a macroeconomic perspective. Okay. Now, what's the, pretty much every policy document in the space argues that there's a business case for greater gender diversity. And why do they argue this? Well, because there's research saying that there's a business case, according to the policymakers. And what is the research that they cite? And this should also scare you. So if you ever want to sort of feel that, you know, there's more academic research to be done, what you should do is take a look at some of these policy documents, and you will get a shock by how little research they actually cite. So this is a big question. I showed you before, there's lots of policy making, very little academic literature. This is an area where there's very little dialogue between policymakers and academics, and it's a bit scary. So the research that the policymakers are citing is this. This is basically a one-page document that was produced by Catalyst in 2007. And it's called The Bottom Line, Corporate Performance and Women's Representation on Boards. And basically all of the research is represented in this graph. They take companies and they look at the return on equity. Okay, and then they plot the return on equity by the bottom quartile of women on the boards of directors and the top quartile of women on boards of directors. And as you see, the bottom quartile has lower return on equity, the top quartile has higher return on equity, and then they say companies with more women on the board of directors outperform those with the least by 53%, hence there is a business case for women on the board of directors. Okay, and here's where the footnote is. They have a footnote here. Correlation does not prove or imply causation, right? But this is a pretty strong statement, right? So if you wrote this in a research paper, your referees would kill you, right? And there's no way that you could footnote your way out of this, right? You would have to actually address the clear endogeneity problems here. So let me just highlight how misleading this is. So here what I did is I took some data from a paper that I have on this issue, and I replicated the catalyst result, and then I did some things to the regression to see, how robust it is. Okay, so the dependent variable here is return on equity. The main explanatory variable is the fraction of female directors, which is the standard diversity measure. This first column, I just regressed this on this, so this here is the correlation. Right, and basically, we see the catalyst result, right? So the more female directors, the greater return on equity, positive and 3 stars, right? And pretty much any sample I've seen, if you just run the correlation, you get the same result, right? So, well, obviously catalyst must be right? I mean, I've just replicated their result. Okay, well now let's look at this a little bit more carefully. I just spent the first half of my talk basically arguing that the data that we have on women's representation is misleading because women are much more likely to sit on the boards of large firms, right? So you look at this first column and you might say, well, what about if we control for firm size? Might be an omitted variable, right? Because I've just argued that women are much more likely to sit on the boards of large firms, and large firms might also have different return on equity. Okay. So let me put in log sales as a proxy for firm size. What happens? All of the stars go from there to log sales. They've just magically moved to the other variable, right? So no stars on fraction female directors. Moreover, the magnitude is now 1/4 of what it was before, right? So you may not care about the magnitudes because it has no stars anyhow, right? But so basically, what does this tell you? All I've done is I put firm size into the regression, and the result disappears. Okay. Now you can do other things to it. You can say, well, what about industry? So you put industry fixed effects in here, and what happens? The magnitude, again, decreases by 50%. Now you can say, what about firm fixed effects? Now the sign is negative, and now it's significant. Okay, now you could say, well, let me put firm and year fixed effects, and by the way, let me control for more stuff. Well, now these other things matter, right? This is still negative, but no longer significant. Okay. Now, if you put a table like this in any of your papers, you would be rejected immediately, right? Because this is not a robust result. Okay. Now you may argue which is the right specification. Well, Catalyst and the policymakers say it is this, right? As finance academics, we might say, well, maybe it's this, right? Or maybe your preferred specification is this, right? Maybe you might say, well, actually women have a negative effect on performance. Okay, and then we could argue, right? But we would have to argue because this is clearly not a robust result. Okay, so what's the problem here? So pretty much every policy document in this space quotes the Catalyst research to justify policy intervention. But the problem is, and there's a lot of people who would like to believe that this is true, right? Because it makes for a good story, right? You add more women to the board and firm performance magically increases. The problem is that wishful thinking does not make for good research, right? So I'm a passionate advocate for diversity, right? But life is just not that simple. And I don't actually think that we do women a favor by making this claim based on very poor, very shoddy research, right? So this is not the way to justify that women belong on boards. And another problem with the business case is it creates false expectations, right? So suppose you're the woman who's appointed to the board. You're supposed to increase shareholder value, right? Now you're a bit unlucky because a financial crisis hit. And so is a CEO going to sit there and say, well, why weren't you doing your job, right? You did not increase shareholder value. We have all this research saying that you're going to increase shareholder value. I don't know how this plays out, right? Okay, so what I argue is that it's very important to recognize that the business case may fail to spur research into the true benefits of diversity and the situations in which it can add value. So obviously diversity must add value, but we've got to figure out which situations they are in which it does add value. So is there a case for diversity? Let me argue that there should be. How am I doing on time? Okay, all right. So let me show you some data on individual preferences that we measured using a survey of directors in Sweden. So my co-author and I, we did a survey of directors in Sweden. One really good thing about Sweden is people like to fill out surveys. So we actually got a very good response rate. And if you can imagine, we surveyed the entire population of directors of listed companies in Sweden, and we got about 36% response rate, which pretty much blows every other survey in finance out of the water, right? Especially if you consider that these are directors, so they're all very busy. You know, Sweden has very well-established companies, so it was pretty incredible. And what we did is we surveyed directors on what are called human values. So there's 10 human values according to the Schwartz Human Value Survey. And the names of the values are achievement, benevolence, conformity, hedonism, power, security, self-direction, stimulation, tradition, and universalism. And what we did in the paper, it was very simple, but we compared the men to the women. Okay. Now, why is this an interesting thing to do? Well, one argument that people make is that as soon as the women reach the boardroom, they're just like the men. Right? So if the women are just like the men, there's actually no case for diversity. Right? Because you put a woman who's just like a man, nothing changes. Right? So in order for there to be a case for diversity, it has to be the case that the women are not just like the men. Okay, so let's see how the women compare to the men. Are they just like the men or not? Okay, so what I have here is just averages of these values. So this right here is 0. So the more you are to the right, the more you emphasize a certain value, and the more you are to the left, the less you emphasize a certain value. And the 1s here are the women, and the 0s are the men. Okay. So now women turn out to be roughly similar in achievement orientation than men. So these are all directors. Okay. Now, female directors are much more benevolent than male directors. You see, almost 50% more. Female directors are much less conformist than male directors. You see this here. Female directors are a little bit more hedonistic than the men. They're much less power-oriented, almost 50% less power-oriented than the men. They're less security-oriented. They're more self-directed than the male directors. They're more stimulation-oriented. They're less tradition-oriented. And they're more universalist. So universalist means you care about broader societal issues. Okay, so what's the point here is that the women are not exactly like the men. If the women were exactly like the men, everything would line up. But there's some places where there are actually significant differences: benevolence, conformity, power orientation, tradition, universalism, right? So the women are actually different from the men, which is a precondition for diversity to actually matter. And this is my favorite comparison. So what this is risk aversion. So the more you are to the right, the more risk averse you are, and this is the women, this is the men. So the women, the female directors, are less risk averse than the male directors, which is of course opposite to what everyone always says, right? Okay, so what is the point? Female directors are not the same as male directors, which is a condition for diversity to matter. But also, what's sort of interesting, and something I want to highlight, female directors are not the same as women in the population. Okay, so let me show you how this works, why I make this claim. So what I have here is differences between directors and individuals in the Swedish population. So one nice thing about the values that we measured is the European Social Survey collects exactly the same measures for the broader Swedish population. So you can actually compare the directors to the population on the same measures. Okay? So what I have here on the left are the men compared to the population. So basically this tells you that a typical male Swedish director is much more achievement-oriented than a typical male in the population. Does it make sense? Of course, you're a director, right? You've got to be very achievement-oriented. Okay, let's look at the rest of the values for the men. So the typical male director is less benevolent than the typical man in the population. Well, we all write papers about agency theory, right? Maybe it makes sense, okay? They're less conformist, less hedonistic, they're more power-oriented than the typical man in the population. Does it make sense? I would say it does, right? They're more self-directed, more stimulation-oriented, and less tradition-oriented than the typical man in the population. I think everything sort of makes sense, right? Now let's look at the women. Okay, so the typical man is more the male director is more achievement-oriented than the typical man in the population. Well, the female director is much more achievement-oriented than the typical woman in the population. A little bit less benevolent, less conformist, more power-oriented, much more self-directed than the typical woman in the population, much more stimulation-oriented than the typical woman in the population, and tradition basically falls off the graph, right? So if you're a female director, you are much less tradition-oriented than the typical woman in the population. Does it make sense? Of course, because being a director is not a typical female job, right? I just showed you there are not many women who are directors, right? In fact, we're overcounting the number. So women are actually quite different, so female directors are quite different from the typical woman in the population, and they're different in ways that one might not expect. Okay, so in the population, the standard gender gaps that people highlight are that women are more benevolent, conformist, security-oriented, tradition-oriented, universalist-oriented than men. While for directors, some of these gender gaps carry through to the boardroom, so female directors are still more benevolent and more conformist than the male directors, but they're much less security-oriented and less tradition-oriented than the male directors. So some of the gender gaps in the population, they actually flip in the boardroom. Okay. Women are generally in the population less achievement, hedonistic, power, self-direction, and stimulation-oriented than the men. But in the boardroom, women are much more self-directed and much more stimulation-oriented. Okay, so the point is that women are not the same as men. Surprise, surprise. But it's important to realize that this also holds in the boardroom. So female directors are not the same as male directors, and they may be different in ways that we might not expect based on population averages. So some of these things don't carry through to the boardroom, some do. Okay. So this means there's a case for diversity. It also means that we need to put in a little bit more effort to try to figure out what are the characteristics of female leaders and how might these actually affect various firm outcomes. Okay, so why is this important? Diversity may matter in many ways that we have not looked at yet. Okay, so let me just make a final point and then wrap up. So why is the business case not obvious, right? So, you know, let me tell you that people generally don't like it when I show that the catalyst result breaks down pretty easily by basically controlling for firm size, right? Because it's a very convenient argument to say, well, there's this positive correlation, women must add value, right? And so, you know, so people don't like it when I destroy the myth. But the reason that I destroy the myth and think it's important to destroy it is because we really need to figure out what are the underlying problems. Like, why is there no clear relationship between board diversity and firm performance? And this relates to societal factors. So why is it not obvious? Well, the way that the debate about diversity is currently framed, it's all a firm level problem. Okay, so all the policies in this space, I showed you that graph, there's all these policies. All of these policies are targeted at firms. So basically what they say is, well, firms need to increase their board diversity. So implicit in this argument is that everything is a problem at the firm level, right? So firms are discriminating. That's the problem. It's all firm level factors. But actually, it's not that simple, right? Because we all know from discrimination theory that if there's competition, this problem should be, should be gone, right? How can it be that there's consistent and persistent discrimination? It's not that simple, okay? So there's actually other factors that matter, societal factors such as female full-time labor force participation, culture, and education that play a role in explaining why few women are on boards. Now, once you understand it, you realize that the policy target may not necessarily just be the firm level. We've got to think broader, right? But first, we have to understand what the problems are. Okay, so let me just highlight why, or show you some graphs to illustrate that societal factors do play a role. So what I have here is a graph from a paper that we wrote where we looked at women in STEM fields, so women on boards in STEM fields. Now, you probably know there's this huge debate about, oh, there's no women in science, right? So everyone talks about, oh, there's no women in science. Actually, the sciences are doing much better in terms of diversity than the finance profession, but, anyhow. So there's no women in science, and so, well, if there's no women in science, who's going to sit on the board of a firm in the science industry? That was our question, right? And so what we did is we said, well, let's look at board diversity, very simple, board diversity for STEM firms, so firms that do science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or have a high proportion of their employees with these types of degrees. And let's just look at board diversity in those firms and then in other firms. Okay, so what we have here, this red line here is board diversity, so just the average diversity, the standard measure across firms in STEM fields. And here we have board diversity across firms that are not in STEM fields. So what do you see? There's a huge gap, right? Board diversity is significantly lower if you're a firm in a STEM industry than if you're a firm in a non-STEM industry. Now we do this also for the US, the same thing. You see the gap is bigger, so both graphs have shifted up, so diversity is generally higher as compared to the rest of the world, but the gap is bigger. Okay. Now, what does this tell you? This tells you that this cannot just be a simple discrimination problem at the firm level, right? So the same factors that explain why there are few women in STEM industries in the labor force also have implications for corporate leadership, right? So there's few women on boards in STEM fields because there are problems that prevent women from going into STEM fields in the first place, right? So this is not a simple, oh, we just need to make the STEM firms have more women on their boards type of thing that you can, you can't solve this problem that easily, right? These are underlying factors that are important. How am I doing on time?
It's left.
1 minute, okay. So let me just show you one more graph to illustrate the point that it's not just a firm level problem. So here what we have is we looked at gender diversity on the boards of banks. So I just told you, like, finance is pretty bad for gender representation. That's also true at the board level. And so we were trying to understand, well, what could explain this, right? What can explain the STEM issue? And our answer was mathematics, okay? Now, one reason people say that women don't go into STEM fields is because people think, well, some people think that women can't do math. Some women think that they can't do math. And so there's a big relationship between math scores in sort of school and whether women enter into STEM fields. Okay. So what we did is we looked across countries. We said, well, let's look at the PISA math scores. So these are scores of 15-year-olds. It's a test done by the OECD. And look at whether there are more women on boards of financial firms when the PISA scores are better for women. Okay. So what we have on the left, we're looking at PISA math scores, so just levels. Okay, and again, we're just plotting diversity. Okay, so here are the banks, the top panel is banks, and here's the non-financials. So the blue line represents diversity on the board of banks if you're in a country with below median math scores, okay, just math scores. And you see in those countries there are less women on boards of banks than in countries where the overall level of mathematics is higher. Okay? Now, interestingly, if you look at non-financials, you don't see the same pattern. Okay? Now, on the right, what we have is we have the gender gap in math, which is male scores minus female scores. Tends to always be positive, unfortunately. And again, we do the same thing. So now a below median math gap is actually good because it means there's a less difference between the men and the women. And so if you are below median in terms of the gender gap in math scores, you have more women on the boards of financials. And here, if you're above median, you have a really big gender gap. There are fewer women on the boards of financials. Now, again, let's look at the non-financials, and you don't see the same pattern, right? Actually, it's the other way around. So if you have a big math gap, you have more women on the boards in the non-financials, which sort of suggests there's a substitution, right? So a big math gap, the women don't sit on the boards of financials, they go to the non-financials, right? Okay. But so what does this tell you? Well, there seems to be some fundamental underlying factor that relates to whether or not women sit on the boards of financials. Okay. Now, you don't solve this problem by simply saying, well, all firms have to have 30% women on the board. Right? That doesn't cut it. That doesn't solve the underlying issue. Okay, so my point is, and this relates also to what Koos was talking about yesterday, so to understand firms, we must understand institutions. Okay, it's not enough to simply do a correlation and say, oh, now we're going to base policy on this correlation, right? This is shocking. So we must understand institution first, and then we can try to figure out what the answer to the problem is. Okay, so to conclude, women may not always be superheroes. I mean, most of the time we are, but you know, there may be some cases in which we're not superheroes. Like occasionally we have a bad day, right? And then we don't save the world on that day. But women will still matter. So gender matters. I haven't shown you much about that, but gender does matter. Women will affect firm and societal outcomes. And there's a lot of policy in this debate. There will be more and more women on boards, so we really have to do much more research in this area. There are many policy relevant unanswered questions. And like I said before, this should scare you. Lots of policy, very little literature. Right? So I would encourage everyone who's interested in these questions to start, you know, getting the data and writing papers on this topic, because this is a great area for research. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Rennie Adams, for that interesting topics. Now we go to the discussion session. We have 15 minutes for discussion. So for all participants who has questions, you can raise your hands and our people will give you the microphone. And don't forget to mention your name. So I opened the discussion session. Okay.
Different view. If the involvement of women pass through certain point, it will impact social problem. For example, spend time mother to keep children regarding emotional and spiritual aspect. What is your opinion about this contradiction?
Okay, I'm not totally sure I understand the question because I missed some of the, because you were looking down, I'd missed some of the words. But so you're saying women can enhance firm performance, but then what happens to the family? Is that the question? Yeah, so this is a big question, right? Because if we encourage more women to go into boards, for example, which, by the way, I'm not sure that we currently are, right? So I think like the policies that are currently out there, they're not really saying we need more women on board. I mean, we're not encouraging more women on boards. Sort of indirectly we are, right? But anyhow, so what happens to the family, right? And so my view is women should have all the choices that men have. And then the women can make the choice, the family can make the choice, right? But we shouldn't restrict choices for women, right? So in order, I think the underlying policy concern that policymakers have is the right one, right? Because if we have a portion of the population whose talents are not being developed in the way that the other portion of the population is developing, then yeah, economic growth can suffer, right? And we can actually tap into that talent and grow. Now, women should have the same choices. If they prefer to work, that's their choice, right? If the family suffers, well, it's not clear, right? Like, I work, I have a son, I struggled with these issues a lot, right? But in the end, I decided that I am a much happier person if I work because I love my work. And as a result, my son will be much happier than if I sat at home. So is it better to have a happy mother or a mother who's at home all the time but is unhappy? It's not obvious, right? So.
Is it enough, Dr. Ivan? For the second questioners?
Rene, two questions. One, is the research at a stage where you're able to highlight some of the key contributions women make to the boardroom? That's one question. Number two, do you find similar or different patterns with respect to racial diversity? Those are two different things.
All right, okay, good questions. So one problem with, well, and this is a general corporate governance problem, is we don't know really what contribution any director makes to the boardroom, right? So what contribution does a woman make? Very hard to measure, right? Now, one thing, so I wrote a paper, which is the paper that the data comes from that I destroyed the Catalyst story with. I wrote a paper where we looked at attendance at board meetings. It's one of the only measures at the director level that we have, at least for the US. So outside of the US, there may be better data. But the U.S. is very limited in terms of data, you know, sort of surprisingly sometimes, right? But so one thing that we showed is that women are more likely to show up to board meetings, and the more women you have on the board, the more the men show up. Okay. Now, I think this is sort of an important finding, right? Because you cannot have an engaged board if the people don't show up to the meeting, right? So if the women are better at showing up, and then that makes the other people better at showing up, that's a good thing, right? So it's not perfect in terms of we would like to know, you know, exactly what goes on. Very hard to measure, right? So, so more research needs to be done. Now, the racial diversity, honestly, you know, one reason why I study gender is because it's easy to measure. You know, of course I'm interested in women, but also, you know, empirically it's easy to measure. If you start getting into racial diversity, very difficult to measure. Right? And so I think the research is just not out there yet, but partly it's a measurement problem, right? So, and then you get into all these issues. Suppose, you know, so the original paper that we had that was published in the JFE, so we showed that if you regress firm performance on the proportion women on boards, well, you don't always find this positive result. In fact, there was, in some cases, a negative result, as I showed you, right? And we were like sitting there, we're going, oh my God, we can't publish this paper. We can't say, oh, if you add more women, it decreases firm value, right? This is horrible, like what are we gonna do, right? And then we found a way out, like which we think is a good way out. We showed that, well, in some cases, they do add value, in other cases they don't add value, and we had a good reason why that's the case. But suppose you do the same thing for racial diversity. Suppose you find a negative relationship on racial diversity. Oh my God, you know, like that problem, that is like, you know, the gender is one thing, but racial diversity, you know. So I think the research isn't there yet. Of course, it's a very important issue, right? And but we need to find ways to approach this question. Also, I think people need to think more about the issues. Like, it's sort of very tempting in the literature. What people do is they say, oh, well, no one's looked at this variable yet, so let me take performance and regress it on this thing and then send the paper to the JFE and hope they publish it, right? But actually, we need to think about some of the issues first in order to write good research in this area, right? Because it's a very sensitive topic, so.
I think I wanted to thank you for this talk today. I think it's fascinating. The question that came in, I also like that sort of question came in because it sort of brings some debate. So some aspect, let's think about, I bring the issue differently. So if somebody says that why should, not through the gender eyes, through the eyes of the class, and says somebody can say, why should a poor person be not going to be educated and go and become someone big? If it is the case, then what's going to happen to the low-level work in the farming and fishing? If fisherman's son and farmer's son becomes board director, who's going to do the farming? So in some sense, it is equivalent to bring this on the gender issue.
Right.
So in that issue would be, a farmer's son also have a dream, whether they decide to become a farmer or to become board director. So that aspect, I think that I really like to answer. But my question is coming towards that the scores that you are showing with the PISA score, which is in some sense is there something you looked into that given the talent pools are similar in a given society, whether that similarity in talent pool in the 15 years old, in the math score between men and boys and girls, whether that sort of creates the corporate performance to be having a gender in the board, the relative marginal impact of the board is higher in countries where the math scores are similar at the age of 15. So that would tell that if the women are in the right woman, qualified woman, and the institutions are done rightly, the marginal impact of women is higher in the board.
Yeah, so we have looked at that, but it's a tricky problem because you have all the usual endogeneity issues, right? And then if you do this cross-country, it's not easy to address, right? So as soon as you go across country, it's just like, you know, all hell breaks loose in terms of identification, right? And that's something I've learned because we started to do some cross-country work, and we've been at it for years now because it's actually a really hard problem. So yeah, but those are the right questions, right? So those are the things we want to get at. So if you have better institutions, do women contribute better? But the reason it's not so obvious is because you could argue, well, if you have bad institutions, so there's a big disparity, then the women who actually make it to the board are going to be really good, right? And so maybe they're going to be so good that when you actually run the regression, it seems like the women are better in the bad institution countries, right? So you have to account for selection. So it's a tricky problem, and it's not easy to figure out exactly how to test this. So we've tried sort of like the standard stuff, but then the more we thought about it, the more we realized that it's not so easy to figure out. So of course, yeah. So, but like I said, there's much more research. I mean, you know, you came up with a question right away. There's so many questions, so many open questions, and interesting and important questions. And we just have not even scratched the surface in terms of research. I mean, that line I showed you, the red line with the numbers of publications, it's pretty pathetic, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, because of the limit time, so I think we have to end this discussion. So please give a round of applause for the first keynote speech, and we will ask Thank you so much, Professor Reni Adams and also Dr. Irwan Trinugroho. You may go back to your seat. Southern Illinois University, USA. He is a professor of economics and finance, holds Master of Economics at Florida Atlantic University and PhD in economics at Arizona State University. So I would like to invite Professor Ali Kutan from Southern Illinois University, USA to deliver your topics.
And thank you all for coming to this conference. It's very interesting, and it's one of the biggest conferences I think we ever attended. Okay, my talk is about institutions, in particular international financial institutions, and their impact on financial markets during financial crisis. So this is a joint work with Gülnur Muratoğlu, Queen Mary University of London. So in this paper, what we are doing is we are looking at the impact of policy announcements of major international financial institutions. In particular, we are looking at the IMF and those key institutions in Europe, including EU offices, European Commission, European Central Bank, and Euro area ministers, and we are looking at the impact of their policy announcements during the Greek debt crisis. And we also have some methodological contribution. And in addition to international financial institutions, we are looking at the importance of rating agencies, government and the public during a financial crisis as far as affecting financial market behavior. So there is a debate whether international financial institutions establish global financial stability, because we are looking at this period of financial crisis in Europe, especially in Greece. We would like to shed further light on this debate. So when you look at the IMF view, according to this view is that IMF and other financial institutions could provide global financial stability. Why? Because they establish structural programs which requires major changes in domestic business practices and firm culture and government behavior in crisis countries. On the other hand, when you look at arguments like Egan Green and others, IMF and other financial institutions impose heavy conditions and on government, on businesses, and which are very hard to implement in practice. So IMF and other actions may be destabilizing. And also, if you are on the camp of the IMF, you argue that IMF and other financial institutions provide liquidity funding to crisis countries. So in that sense, they play an important role as a lender of last resort. On the other hand, opposite view argue that IMF help to crisis countries is not necessarily desirable because of moral hazard effects of IMF actions. So we have two types of moral hazard. One is the creditor moral hazard. So what happens is that investors may take risky investments in crisis countries because they expect implicit guarantees to lenders in that country. Another type of moral hazard is debtor moral hazard. Due to IMF support, money is coming in, so the governments may not implement very costly reforms. So there is a big debate, and we want to shed further light on this debate, which side of the camp seems to be getting it right. So let me give you some selected work, impact of IMF programs on financial markets. So one of the very first paper published in AER, Schultz and his co-authors, for example, they look at the IMF support programs and how it affects the US banks' abnormal returns during financial crisis in many countries. And their evidence showed that US banks tend to earn high abnormal returns, suggesting that there is an increase in investor confidence so that shares value went up. In a follow-up paper, they look at not only US bank, but also they look at the local banks, and they find that IMF programs have a positive but economically less significant impact. And when we look at another paper, Braille and Kaplanis, they look at a broader sample of IMF programs, and other than just those during the Asian crisis, they saw that there was a big decline in terms of shares and returns of companies and asset prices, including home prices. But when the IMF support came in, and we don't see any recovery of those assets, indicating that investor sentiment was not positive. Some of the papers I have done with my co-authors that we look at IMF policy announcements during the Asian, Russian, and Brazilian crisis, and we find that IMF announcements and IMF-related news are important when we have like negative news, for example, delay in loans, and the governments do not agree with IMF advice, so there was a decline in the market, and vice versa. For example, program approvals increase stock returns. In another paper, we look at the IMF program negotiations and program approval on financial sector, again during the Asian crisis in Indonesia, Korea, and Thailand, and we find that program approvals and negotiations help raise stock returns in these countries. Another paper look at the international mutual funds rather than other types of asset markets, and they find that this study that international institutional investors increased their investment during the months when the IMF support came into these countries, again suggesting improved investor confidence due to IMF programs. So what's the summary of available empirical evidence? First of all, the evidence is mixed. Some studies find that IMF support helps improve investor confidence reflected in higher stock returns and vice versa. But the problem with these studies, is including my work, is that we look at these selected events, for example, IMF program announcements or negotiations. And so that means they don't control for other IMF-related news, for example, reaction from the government, reaction from the public, and so that can be also very, very important in terms of judging the overall significance, relevance of IMF-related programs. And also, they just look at basically the financial and banking sectors in the stock market, but they don't look at the real sectors such as consumers, manufacturing sectors, and that can be also very, very important in terms of overall impact of IMF support. So what we do in this paper is we think we have a better and more comprehensive methodology and approach. So what we do is, besides IMF, we look at other international financial institutions and see whether they also have an important role in private financial markets and whether they have a positive or negative influence on investor confidence. And we also look at the real sectors in addition to financial and banking sectors. And in addition, we are looking at the interaction between the financial institutions globally and the government and the public in crisis in general. And to do so, we use the Greek crisis as our kind of lab to answer these questions. So why Greece? Why the Greek crisis? Well, it's very interesting because it's the first crisis in the Eurozone. And so it helps us to answer our questions, including the interaction between the IMF, European Central Bank, the government, Greek government, and the public in Greece. And so we had many international players during the Greek crisis, IMF, and many, many European Union offices and central bank. And also we had rating agencies rating the, the Greek government bonds and other assets. And so there was a heavy involvement coming from the Greek government, and also we have involvement of Greek citizens in terms of demonstrations, even riots. And so, as you see, this is a very kind of a complex issue. It's very difficult to, identify the impact of many players on private financial markets. But it's a more realistic approach. Again, earlier studies just focus on just the IMF, ignoring all other key players like the government, the public. Okay, so we had three packages in terms of bailout helping the Greek government to calm down the financial markets. And the first bailout package had this aim of restoring confidence and maintain financial stability. And IMF has been a lender of last resort, but during the Greek crisis, we had additional financial institutions, European Central Bank, European Commission. We would like to see whether other institutions can be also as important as IMF support. So could we extend the debate, coming from IMF to other financial institutions such as European Central Bank? And so when you look at the crisis period, and the Greek case is very kind of interesting because real GDP was very positive in the country right before the financial crisis. For example, GDP growth was average 2 times higher than the average Euro area real GDP growth rate, 2 to 4%. And also during before the crisis, we seen many unsustainable drivers. For example, because of the membership to Eurozone, the country was receiving lots of capital inflows, so that was helping. But we didn't know whether it was a kind of a short time or is it kind of a permanent increase in capital inflows. And private consumption was growing very significantly due to increases in real wages and high credit growth and low interest rates. And also public spending increased significantly. And real wages in the public sector also went up by more than 50%. And pension system and healthcare system were not financially unsustainable in the long run. And there was an issue of fiscal issues like tax evasion. And also there was a significant increase in the real exchange rate, hurting the competitiveness of the economy. Also, we had fiscal issues, especially increased accumulation of the debt. External debt, government debt increased significantly, and also the government missed its fiscal targets frequently. But the big trigger was the election in October 29. When we have the new government elected in October 2009, and the new government announced that the previous fiscal budget deficit numbers was really understated heavily. For example, new government announced that 6.7 budget deficit reported by the previous government really amounted to almost 2 times, about 13%, significantly higher than the 3.7% predicted earlier in April. So there was a big shift in investor confidence, and so that really lowered the investor confidence. And as of December 2009, Greek bonds were classified as junk, further increasing the government borrowing costs. And as a result, Greece requested bailout talks from the IMF, EU, and European Central Bank. Together, we call them Troika, 3 financial institutions, and the country had received 3 bailout packages since then. So I know I have limited time, and so I'm going to go over these packages very quickly. The first bailout package was big. So the government received 80 billion euros from the euro area members, and the IMF provided 30 million euros to Greek government based on a 3-year standby agreement. And what were the kind of the conditions? The conditions were really cut the budget deficit, improve fiscal stance, and eliminate waste and reduce corruption, and raise taxes and cut benefits. So the Greek people were not very happy about this, and they had lots of demonstrations. So the aim of this first package was to restore confidence, investor confidence, and maintain financial stability. But that was not enough. So the economic condition, financial market confidence didn't improve very quickly, so they needed further help. Hence, February 2012, we had a second bailout package, and again, the purpose of the second package was very similar to the goals of the first package, except that the second package emphasized more economic growth. And so, but the key condition for the second bailout package is that bank, making loans, debt holders had to accept losses on their bonds. So they were not saved by the government, by the European Union, or by the IMF. So this negatively affected Greek banks because they were holding about $30 billion in government bonds. So if those bonds didn't do well, they were losing money. So that was very significant. And then we had the third bailout package in 2015. Then we had a new election, and in 2015, February, then a new government tried to negotiate a new deal with the European Union, the IMF, but they didn't do well. The negotiations didn't go well, And July 2015, European Central Bank stopped funding, emergency funding to the Greek government, and Greece closed banks and imposed capital restrictions so that people couldn't take money out of the country. And Greek people also had a referendum, and they rejected the EU, European Union conditions. And finally, in August 2015, there was an agreement between the Greek government and its creditors and to have a third bailout package now, 86 billion euros. So as you see, lots of money going into the government, and that means in return, the Greek government is supposed to cut spending and to avoid bankruptcy and exit from the Eurozone. Now, the key purpose of this paper is we want to see the impact of international financial institutions on stock market, okay? And how are we going to do it? So we need some kind of theoretical background. So we use this paper published in JME, Corsetti and co-authors. So they have developed this theoretical framework to study impact of international financial institutions providing lending to crisis countries. So they argue that support coming from these international financial institutions have two effects. One is catalytic effect. So that means is that this is a positive effect in terms of on stock returns because of the liquidity support coming from the international financial institutions improve investor confidence. Not only that, those people want to take their, the investment out of the country. They keep it in the country because of the support coming from these financial institutions. So as a result, international support can provide financial stability and reduce the amount of investments that have to be liquidated. So as a result, IMF support from the European Union offices, good in terms of raising stock market returns, because we expect higher economic growth measured in terms of GNP or GDP. On the negative side, as I mentioned, we have this moral hazard issues associated with the support of international financial institutions, such as debtor moral hazard, creditor moral hazard, and these will have a negative impact on private market performance in terms of a cut in stock market returns. But according to Corsetti et al., the theory, moral hazard only takes place when the likelihood of a speculative run is high. So speculative run, that means, the people and investors run and, rush and withdraw their money from the country. And so if you believe moral hazard is small, then the catalytic effect dominates moral hazard effect, then we expect an improvement in financial market returns. So as a result of this theoretical framework, we have this following empirical hypotheses that any events, announcements, signaling liquidity, money coming into the country, will improve stock returns and investor confidence. On the other hand, if you have events signaling negative news, like delay in aid, or the Greek government doesn't have an agreement with IMF or European Union offices, or the public doesn't like what's going on, then we will have a negative impact on stock returns. In our paper, we are looking at not only the banking sector, financial sector, but we are also looking at other sectors in the stock market, real sectors. For example, consumers, manufacturing, tourism sector, which is very important for Greece. So because the financial crisis really starts in the financial markets like the banking, so we should expect that any kind of announcements will have a bigger impact on financial sectors than real sectors. So as a result, we claim that the impact will be less on the real sector than the financial sectors. Okay, then let me talk about the data and our methodology. And so first we need to identify crisis period. So we use an event study here. So during our sample period, we also had, the global financial crisis started in the USA. So it's difficult to choose a sample period. So we decided that October 19, 2009 will be our sample, beginning of our sample period, when we had a new government elected in Greece. And they also announced that the true budget was initially underreported by the previous government, which as a result, we had the riots in Athens and downgrades in Greek credit ratings. And our ending point of research covering the first two bailouts, because the last one was kind of later in 2015, so in this paper we just focus on the first two bailouts, where we have lots of interactions between the international financial institutions, Greek government, and the Greek public. So our sample period ends June 29, 2012, when European Union agrees to keep the Greece in the Eurozone, and also Greek government and the public share that interest. So that's our sample period. And our stock price, we use the data stream. So our stock market sectors, we have banking, financials, and these are our financial sectors. In terms of real sectors, we use basic materials, consumer goods, and industrials, travel and leisure, and so we use the Greek market index to compute abnormal returns. They are all in local currency. Note that previous studies really focus on banking and financial sectors, so in this paper we focus also on real sectors. Okay? So event data is, let me go back, let's see. Okay, we have about 237 events. They are all hand collected from various sources. The reason we use various sources is we don't want to double count the events and double check the, our event descriptions and event dates. So these are all the sources of events. And so we classify the events based on our key major players. One of them is the Greek government. So we had 47 events, including like announcements of government policy, budget approvals based on the support coming from IMF, EU offices, announcements made to the general public, and reactions to international organizations and Greek public demonstrations. Then we have credit rating agencies. So we had 17 news regarding changes in the credit ratings of the government. And we have, as you see, significant public reaction. So previous studies ignore this, importance of the local government and public reaction. So we had significant number of reactions, 88 public reactions, and we classified them into three groups. Public reactions following EU announcements, following Troika, that means including IMF, European Central Bank, three major institutions, and public reaction following government announcements to see which one is more significant in terms of affecting stock market behavior. And this is an event study we had joint policy announcements 44 because some of the events overlap. So it's hard to isolate the impact of, so joint policy announcements include IMF and several EU institutions and Greek government. And also we have Troika, and so it includes European Central Bank, EU offices, and IMF. So we look at them, their joint impact, but also we look at their individual impact as well. So we had 41 events. So in terms of classifying news, we classify them into good news and bad news based on two approaches. One is like the conformity approach. So we use the theory of Corsetti et al. So if there is money coming in, like IMF or EU, providing liquidity to Greek government, and so we take it as a positive, good news, okay? And for example, government action supporting IMF programs, European Union programs, we also classify them good news. Withholding program aid, delays in negotiations, government opposition, we classify them as bad news based on our theoretical framework. And the second one is market approach. So we use the general market index to classify our news. For example, when the index drops, it's negative news, and vice versa. So it's a standard event methodology. We use market-adjusted return, and so we use the log difference to compute our returns. We report our results for different window periods, time 0, and for robustness, we use the day before and after, and also we go up to 5 days before and that. And of course, when you have a larger window, you have a significant reduction in number of events due to fast speed of information arrival. Okay, so these are our results. And so what we are doing here is, so these are like the Greek government announcements and actions, credit rating agencies, public reactions. These are the joint policy announcements. This is Troika. That's the European Central Bank, EU offices, and IMF, all. So let's go, for example, here. For example, bad news, okay? So what happens in the banks and the financial sector? You see there is a negative significant impact. Either there is a delay or there is a criticism of the government policies. So in banking and financial sector on that day, so this is T0, there is 1%, about 1% drop in the financial sector. But although you see a significant drop, and in other sector, there is a significant increase in consumer goods and travel and leisure, despite bad news. Okay? So how do you explain that? Okay? So one reason is maybe different economic fundamentals expected in these real sectors. Another is maybe portfolio composition. Now, you know, these sectors are not doing well. Maybe some investors putting their money in this sector. Another explanation is maybe these real sectors highly, maybe they expect some implicit guarantees. So we need further research. But typically what happens in all estimations, okay, when we have bad news, it hurts financial sectors, but it doesn't hurt the real sector as much as the financial sectors. So there is an asymmetric reaction, okay? And when we have like good news, money coming in, so there is a significant increase in banking and financial sectors. But bad news has a bigger impact, 4 times bigger impact than good news. Again, when we have good news and improving banks and financials, other markets have a negative return. So still you see a symmetric impact. So that's very interesting. I think we need further research and understand what's going on here. So what seems to be good news for banking and financial news seems to be bad news for the real sector, okay? So let's look at, for example, Greek government. Again, bad news coming from the government hurts banks and financial, but again, improves the real sectors. And good news coming from the government doesn't have much impact, but it improves real sectors, but evidence is mixed. It hurts industrials and basic materials. How about credit rating agencies? Bad news for the banking and financials, but seems to be not affecting the real sector much, even positive impact on consumer goods. Good news coming from the credit agencies, still negative. So these good news may be not as good as expected because we are in a crisis period. All right? So overall, we see that the banking and financial sector has a bigger impact of bad news relative to good news, and the evidence on the real sector is kind of just the opposite, or quite mixed. So what we did is now we decompose Greek public reactions into 3 parts. We want to see what kind of announcements are more significant. Public reactions following EU announcements, or Troika, or government announcements. As you see, coming from following EU announcements, bad news has a very big impact, 141%, 125%, and other sector is kind of a mix, but the bigger impact. And so the biggest impact coming from public reactions following EU announcements. Then we look at, this is very important in terms of the earlier literature. So we want to see which one is more significant in terms of, oops, what did I do? Okay, so now I need to go. Can you go there? Sorry about that. One more. Okay. I don't want to do this, but let's see. Okay. Again. Okay, so now I got it. Okay. Sorry, okay. So what's important here, next slide, please. So what we want to do is that Troika includes European Central Bank, EU, and IMF. So we want to compare whether the IMF support relative to EU, which one is important. So when you look at like IMF events like bad news, 1.20, 1.5, is as significant as news and support coming from EU announcements. So when we start doing this project, we thought that IMF support will be less important. IMF announcements will be less important because this is a Eurozone country, part of the European Union. But when you look at this, and the IMF announcements, IMF support is really affecting the markets as much as the EU offices, and these are the all together, okay? So IMF programs, announcements seem to be as important as, so there is a big role for IMF programs even in Eurozone economies. So that's the kind of the signal. So this slide I thought was very interesting. And also we did some larger, we increased the window period. Earlier slide was just on the same day of announcements. Here we are looking at the day before and the day after. And so when you look at Troika, for example, and because we have a larger window, for example, bad news has a still significant impact, but it goes down like 0.1%, and a 0.25% troika, bad news. Earlier it was like 1%, because you are looking at, like a larger window, so they have a less impact. So when you raise the window length, and still significant, but the impact gets reduced. But again, the public reactions is still very, very significant. Public reactions, good news, bad news. So the public reactions become more significant than EU or IMF announcements. So that's very important. It's a very complex process analysis, because you have many, many players in this case. And then we use the market approach. So we let the market to decide, whether then we subjectively say, this is good news, this is bad news. And you get very similar results. For example, when you look at Troika, bad news, still about 1%. And that was very similar to when we used the conformity approach based on our theoretical framework. So you get very, very similar results here. And these are the, again, public reactions. Now, here, what happens here is that public reactions following EU announcements, like bad news, 1.2%, but also public reactions following Greek government announcements also become very, very significant, like 0.92%. Okay? So it tells you that public reactions is very, very significant during the financial crisis. So what does it tell you? Suppose you just rely on IMF support. You invest in the stock market. You ignore the reaction from the public. You may lose money. So if you want to understand the overall importance of support coming from international financial institutions, you need to think about how the markets will react to news coming from the public, like riots, demonstrations, and also reaction of the local government, because that may affect your portfolio returns. And this is also breakdown, very important. Now, when you use the market approach, IMF events are not as important as European Union announcements. For example, bad news lowered the banking sector 1.37%. Bad news lowered it by 0.5%. So results are a little bit sensitive to which approach you use, market or conformity approach. But still, both IMF and international financial institutions like EU offices are significant. And we did the robustness test, and here, when we do robustness tests, you get bigger impact when you use the market approach. For example, when you look at Troika, bad news on the banking sector has 2.37%. On financials, 2%. Greek government, 1.9%. So with the market approach, you get more significant results. Okay? All right. So what do we learn? 10 minutes, so I'm ahead of the time. And so our contribution is really improve the literature on IMF support, importance of IMF announcements, calming financial markets, improving global financial stability during financial crisis. So the Greek crisis is a very important case study. Why? Because Greece is part of the Eurozone and the European Union, and we have a very complex set of events, interactions, and previous studies just focus on IMF. So we extended literature, include more financial institutions, such as European Central Bank, European offices. We also include reaction coming from the government, reaction coming from the public. We also include real sectors in addition to financial sectors. And so we find that banking and financial sectors have greater response to the crisis news than real sectors, okay? But the real sector reactions were mixed. I think this is a very important research area. Why we have this asymmetries. For example, we have bad news, the IMF delays liquidity to Greek government. So we have a decline in the banking financials, but in other sectors, we have a kind of a mixed reaction. Sometimes positive, sometimes no impact, okay? Public reactions very, very important during a financial crisis. So if you want to do a study whether financial institutions are important, improving investor confidence, you need to account for additional reactions, like coming from the public, coming from the local government. And we see that violent and large demonstrations have very significant effects on stock returns. Okay? So IMF comes, injects liquidity, stock returns may go up. But that might be offset by what? Negative impact of demonstrations, riots on the stock market. Okay? And markets most responsive to policy action from Troika. So EU, European Central Bank, IMF. But also IMF is still very significant, although Greece is part of the Eurozone. So that means that IMF programs may still be successful in crisis periods rather than like, Asian crisis, Russian or Brazilian. So IMF involvement is still significant even in like union type of setting, European, Eurozone kind of setting, okay? So we need really further research on moral hazard effects during the crisis. Maybe that can explain the mixed reaction in the real sector. And you can, extend this methodology to other Euro area countries receiving bailout like Spain, Ireland. Also, we know that now, Italy, we had some issues. So I think this methodology could be very useful if you want to do some type of analysis looking at the impact of institutions on financial markets. You need to account the impact of other key players. You cannot ignore that, because if you want to look at the overall impact, success of sport programs coming from international financial institutions, you need to account how the public and the government, local government reacts to it. So I'm going to stop here so that we have enough time for the other presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ali Kutan, for the interesting topics. We will ask you to remain on the stage for the discussion session. Yes. So now we are open for the questions coming from the participants. Everyone having questions?
Ali, I think it's good that you brought a research topic back into the literature again, because it has been very prominent literature after the Asian crisis, and it's rightly to bring it back. One area where you might be benefiting from adding some depth with the amount of money. So you start the process from 2009, when the election came in Greece. But the actual money was given first by IMF 2010, May 9th, $200 billion. And May 10th, ECB comes and gave $500 billion with some commitment. So in some sense, your result would look even better if you can say the IMF still comes up to be bigger despite it is only 100, 200 million compared to ECB 500 billion. So in some sense, some sort of quality or depth measure of the relative bailout amount might make your conclusion even stronger. In saying so, on the other side, the entire paper is based on market reaction. And in the market reaction, you're taking usual market model with 360, 50 days or 20 days in the back, but you're looking at the Greek stock exchange. It might be worthwhile to look at the benchmark, a European basket of stock exchange, something of that sort. It's unusual practice, I'm thinking, but the market is so much scattered that time. It is so much decline upward. So these 2%, 1% increases and others that we are seeing, in that sort of environment, I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just bringing the debate that how to really interpret that if we don't take a basket of market. Something to think about.
Okay, thank you. Good comments, yeah, I appreciate it. Any other questions?
Just a quick question. So, I don't know the details of the paper, Corsetti paper that you referred to, but the liquidity effects that you find based on the Greek stock market, do you think you'll get similar stock responses in other economies where the liquidity might be higher?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when you look at the Asian crisis, Russian crisis, Brazilian crisis, yes. IMF support in terms of like negotiations, signaling liquidity is coming in, or approvals are associated with higher stock returns. So our evidence is consistent. So I think the key point in our paper that, like as I mentioned, because this is a Eurozone country, I expected that IMF wouldn't be as important, because it's not a key player. You got the European Central Bank, European offices, but still very significant. I think just signaling effect of the IMF, like Iftekhar said, despite the low amount of funding, still it's very important in terms of signaling, like the lender of last resort. So that's a very important issue.
Thank you.
And another questions? If there is no questions, I think we have to end these sessions. So thank you, Professor Ali Kutan, and now I will...
Do I get something?
Yeah, I would like to invite Professor Tulus Haryono as the Director of Doctoral Programs in Economics, Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas 11 Maret, to give a token of appreciation to Professor Ali Kutan as the second keynote speaker in the second day of plenary session. Thank you, Professor Ali Kutan, for the interesting topics. You may go back to your seat. And now we move to the last keynote speech, which will be delivered by... I would like to invite Professor Herman Merchant to give the material. Please give a big round of applause.
Good morning. I realize I'm standing between you and lunch, and this is always a dangerous thing, so I'm going to keep it relatively short. Any questions that you may have? If it's a yes-no question, you can ask very quickly. Anything that requires more than a yes or no, we can talk over the lunch. Yeah? So, one of the things that I come from a strategy background and an international background, and a lot of the work that I have done has to do with things that are very much global. And one of the things that I see in my extensive role as editor in many, many journals is that there is very limited research on Asia that is being published, especially in the top-tier journal. And I ask myself that why this is the case, especially in the case of Indonesia, where we know from a strategy perspective very, very little. And I ask myself why. In a country of 260 million people and a civilization that is thousands of years old, why are there no stories that are presented from here to the West? And this is a question that I want to focus on, because a lot of the stories that I see now coming out are basically telling the same story that has been said in the West for at least the last 10, 15 years, only with Indonesian data. In other words, what the people here seem to be doing is taking a Western research question that has been around for 15 years, using Indonesian data and finding the results. Surely there is much more to this than a simple replication. And so the question that I ask is, why is there not an Indonesian story in the leading journals in the West? And so my presentation today has a lot of things to say about that, and my own experiences which I want to share. I'm not going to share my research, but my own experience related to one such thing that I tried to do, and what are the opportunities and what are the challenges of trying to break out from the box that has been around for a very, very long time. And I hope that this story is something that is of some interest to you. The Chinese have a saying that the longest journey starts with just one step. And this is the case also for the academics. If you look at finance, the concept of beta actually came from a footnote in a 1950 dissertation that eventually won the Nobel Prize. And the idea of beta eventually also won a Nobel Prize. So those of you, and I think most of you here are finance academics, have you heard of this book called Capital Ideas by Peter Bernstein? Anybody? Peter Bernstein, Capital Ideas. If you are a finance academic, you have to read that book. Absolutely, absolutely have to read that book. The other example about the core competence of the organization, some of you may have heard of the name C.K. Prahlad. That concept, which is now embedded in the mind of CEOs and companies and senior management, essentially came from one observation. And also the idea that performance And in my case, firm performance, which I measured as stock market value, also came from one observation. And this was many, many years ago that I was trying to write my dissertation, and I tried to figure out what was going on. And so I simply created an Excel spreadsheet. And what I saw on the Excel spreadsheet was there was mixed evidence. Are you guys controlling it, or am I controlling it? Are you controlling? I'm controlling. Okay. In my case, what I found, a lot of my research is on joint ventures, and what I found was that there was mixed evidence about the effect of joint venture announcements on shareholder value. And of the studies that looked at the individual influences on firm performance, there were also very, very mixed results. For the same variable, you saw one study that says it has a positive effect, you had another study that said it was a negative effect, and a third study that said there was no effect. Exactly the same variable, operationalized exactly the same way. Obviously, this does not make sense. So, what happened? This is my starting point. The conventional wisdom was that strong firms, firms that had the resources, firms had the experience, firms had the managerial talent, and so on and so forth, those firms should expand overseas through joint ventures, and firms that did not have this expertise should not expand, the so-called weak firms. The other conventional wisdom was that firms that are expanding must always expand to favorable locations where the political risk was low, the language was similar, the culture was similar, regulatory regimes were favorable, and so on. And the idea that if you went to an unfavorable location, the company is going to have huge problems. This was the conventional wisdom. The reality, in fact, was quite different. The reality, what you saw, is that the weak firms were also expanding, and firms were also expanding to locations that would be considered unfavorable. The academics were telling one story, the practitioners were telling a completely different story. And how would this make sense? Because intuitively it does make sense. You don't go to locations where you are going to jeopardize your investment. And you should not expand if the company was not ready to expand in terms of resources and managerial talent and so on and so forth. So how do you take these two ideas, both of them have strong evidence, and try to reconcile them? That was my question to myself. What were we missing? Again, these are questions to myself. What were we missing? Was the theory completely wrong? Was the data different? Were the methods different? And these are parts of our papers that we realize. What was going on here? This is a question to myself, given what we knew about what had happened. So what I tried to do is I tried to approach this issue of joint venture performance from a completely different way. And of course, the way that I was trained to think about was to look at it from a very, very disciplined perspective, using very, very refined very rigorous statistical methods. And I won't get into the details of my paper, other than to say that I used something very different that was already accepted. It was just not used in my field, in my line of research. And I tried to keep as many things similar as I could so that the data were not driving the results. And of course, the method I used was a method that was actually borrowed from biological sciences, not in management, because the management people had always used regression, and the regressions had always produced inconsistent answers. So we need to get out of our comfort zone and look at a method that was more in line with the theory that I had in mind, but that was different from what was used in the field. The findings of my study, were that if you are a weak firm going into an unfavorable location, you would have negative performance. Makes sense? You don't have the resources and you go to a location that is not a favorable location. Yeah? For a small fellow going into a tough neighborhood, you are going to get in trouble. Made a lot of sense. Next slide, please. The previous studies had basically said that if you are in an unfavorable location, you will have negative results. If you are a weak firm, you will have negative performance. In other words, what the studies were saying, that to be able to make shareholder value, you had to be a strong firm going to a good location. And there was absolutely nothing new here. You are a big fellow going to a tough neighborhood, going to a neighborhood that is very pleasant to go with, and you would get the performance. So the findings that my work produced were completely different from the findings that everybody else had produced over the last probably 10 years or something like that, 15 years or something like that. I don't want to get too much into the details, but the theoretical argument was this, that there were two kinds of value creating mechanisms. Mechanism one was that you had firms who had the qualities that made them strong. These firms actually went to the unfavorable locations, what I call here firm dominant strategy. And then you had the weaker firms, firms who did not have all the resources, who actually went and selectively chose markets that were favorable to what they had been doing. And my study identified that both of these firms, both of these strategies actually created value, significant value, in, if I remember correctly, about $300 million each. So that is a significant amount of money, considering that the phenomena I was studying is a joint venture, which is a very tiny part of the overall firm. So there was some hope. Next slide. I had two reactions to my findings. The first reaction was that, yes, Hemant, it makes sense, but it's too good to be true. At one level we can understand this, but we don't buy it. The second reaction was even worse, saying that, Merchant, you are very good with statistics, and you have played these statistical games, and you have produced the results that you are presenting to us. This was the first reaction. This was the reaction from most of the academics. This was the reaction from most of the top-tier journals, where, by the way, this paper was rejected. Not once, but several times. Yeah? First reaction. Second reaction. Oh my God, what have you done here? Some of you may recognize these two individuals, both of them who unfortunately passed away not too long ago. Professor John Dunning, who is very, very widely regarded as the grandfather of international business. When he read my paper, he sent me a handwritten note, basically saying that, Hemant, this is exactly the kind of studies we should be doing. First reaction. From a fellow who undoubtedly, okay, is regarded as a leading, not the leading, the leading academic in international business. The second gentleman, whom you may have known, C.K. Prahlad, he was a very good academic, but he was also a very good practitioner. So when I told him my story, that C.K., I think I have written a very nice paper, and every major journal has rejected it. His reaction to me was, Hemant, you are on to something. The job of academic journals is to reject papers, as most of us know. Yeah? So, if all of the journals have rejected your paper, you must be on to something really, really unique. Okay? This coming from somebody who at that time was the world's highest paid consultant. He would come to your companies for 8 hours, charge you an amount of money that exceeds the salary of most of us in this room, and at the end of the day, he would decide whether your problem is interesting enough for him to address. So, clearly, a very well regarded practitioner. The top academic says, Hemant, this is the kind of work you should do. The top practitioner says, Hemant, you are on to something. And what happened? Lot of congratulations, lot of kudos, no top tier publications, 0. Yeah. Best paper finalist won a national award, international award, got an invitation from Ernst & Young to present this to their group. I had somebody at PricewaterhouseCoopers contacted me, say, Professor Merchant, we would like to take this study and share it with our in-house team. So do we have your permission to do that? There is a new journal that has started in India, Emerging Market Ideas. They found this particular paper and said that this is the kind of paper we want in our inaugural issue, and so on and so forth. And of course, several presentations, reprints, and so on and so forth. But lot of kudos, lot of handshakes, lot of good work, Hemant. 0 top tier publications, which is very, very disheartening. Especially when I myself thought that, and I still think, that I will never write a better paper than the one that I have written. You know, one of the best papers I have written. And C.K. Prahlad used to say that, Hemant, the cost of writing a paper is about $10,000 to $15,000 in research time and this and that. If you had $15,000, would you buy your paper? This paper, I would buy. I have that much confidence in this work. Bottom line, academics come in and say, we don't know, Merchant, what you are doing. It's nice, it's elegant, but this is something that we are not very comfortable with. Next slide, please. Where do you draw the inspiration for these kinds of papers? And I ask this to you because I started by saying that there are stories here, lots of stories. And just because I don't know those stories doesn't mean that the stories don't exist. And this is a big challenge for our Indonesian colleagues here and Asian colleagues in general. You can draw the inspiration from the context. What is the context? What are the stories in the context, institutional context? You heard Professor Adams talk about that. What are the stories that are embedded in the institutions, the local institutions? What are the colleagues saying? Are you going to go with the masses and study one more of the same relationship using a different data set? Or are you going to take a different trend and say, I'm going to explore something new because I think this is interesting? And of course, do you have the curiosity to continue down that path? Next slide, please. There are 4 things that I think that we need as academics. And the easy way to remember this is to think of them in terms of the natural elements. The first thing, of course, is we need to be humble and we need to be grounded. If we don't understand the world around us, you cannot try to make sense out of it. And just because you have made some sense out of it doesn't mean that it should go to your head. If you are the first person or one of the earliest persons who have thought of this, it is very, very important to be humble. The second thing is, of course, the flexibility and the inquisitiveness to follow things. And you look at water. Water takes the shape of any container that you put it into. It's very, very flexible. You cannot live without water, but water does not have an agenda. And we need to understand that. The third thing is the inner strength to pursue what you believe needs to be pursued. And do we have it? Even if we have a rejected paper at the end of the day. Or do we want to take the easy path and say, okay, this is the flavor of the month in academic journals, let me write a paper on that, quick and easy, and let's get it over with. Are you committed to your own ideas? Do you believe in your own ideas? And the final thing, of course, is to be aware of what is going on in the academia and to be non-judgmental about it. And this is very hard to do because all of us have our opinions, all of us are smart, all of us have PhDs, and we have our biases. The trick is to have your biases, recognize that you have your bias, and then not let the bias interfere with your interpretation. And this is very hard to do as well. But here are the elements, in my view, that I think we need to go down the journey that is a path-breaking journey, to tell a story that is a story that is not a story that has been said 15 years ago with US data, but a story that is unique to the context, using a data that is embedded in the context, even if that context is unfamiliar to the larger audience. And this is something that we need to be very, very mindful of. Do you trust yourself? If the whole world is against you, if all the academics are against you, if all the major journals are against you, do you still believe in what you have done? I had a paper that came to me not too long ago, and they were missing some pieces. And what they were missing was a big theory. There was everything in the paper except the theory. So I wrote back to the author a very nice small email saying, paper is wonderful, but I need some way to understand what you are telling me. Our readers need to understand what you are saying. And the reaction was machine gun fire. Right? Bang, 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 bang. You know, how can you say this to me? I'm so well published. I have so many this, I have so many that. Instead of using that energy to write some kind of a framework to understand the findings, this fellow basically pulled out the gun and said, listen, I am the greatest thing that happened to your journal, and you can't tell me what I should include and what I should not include. You have the courage to challenge. But you have to remember that at the end of the day, we need to have some continuity. And theory provides that continuity between the past and the present and future. So, do we have the courage to challenge convention using strong theoretical foundations? And I'm not saying that these theories have to be the Western theories. Theories that are context specific, that would take time to develop, but it can be done. First thing. Second thing, if everybody says this is a garbage paper, do you have the stamina to continue? Huh? That question only you can answer, nobody can answer. Do you have the power to continue? And the third thing, which is a problem that faces all of us who are non-native English speakers, is the language. You have great ideas, you have great execution, but where we fail is in a failed communication. In other words, you write a paper that nobody understands, and you expect that the reviewer will get into your head, figure out what you are trying to say, accept the paper, and then you can say, yes, I have a 4-star paper. That's not going to happen. So, do you trust yourself to challenge? Do you trust yourself enough to feel confident regardless of what the people say? And then, do you have the, how shall I say, the recognition that communication is really what makes a paper and what breaks a paper? If I was God's greatest gift to international business, I stand in front of you and I say absolutely nothing for 15 minutes. Would it matter to you that I'm God's greatest gift to international business? Anybody? It is the same with our papers. Exactly the same with our papers. You got brilliant ideas. If you can't communicate them, you don't have a brilliant idea. And rest of it does not matter. Next slide. I leave you with this quotation, which I have found very inspiring, as I've had this for many, many years now. And some of you may have seen this, some of you may have come across this, and so on. That people see things as they are and they ask why. You know, why are we getting these mixed findings? Why is there so much debate on this and that? People ask those questions all the time. But do you have the courage to ask the other question and to dream things that did not exist and ask, why don't these things exist? And if you can dream something like that, I think we have fabulous stories coming out of Asia. Fabulous stories. I come to Asia very, very frequently. And what saddens me is that most of the Asian academics are just trying to catch the last wagon on a long train of Western ideas. And as an editor, I ask myself, why are you doing this? And I have not had a satisfactory answer yet. So I leave you with one question that I am asking myself, which is that what is it that we academics based in Asia or studying Asia in some way, what is it that we can do to bring our stories, which are unique, which are beautiful, which have a lot of things to offer to the West, and offer also in terms of the comparison between the Western theories that have been around for a long time and the theories that are still emerging in Asia. What can we do to bring our Asian ideas, Asian context, and Asian energy to studies that we already know a lot about? So I leave you with that question, and I see that some of you are already looking at your clocks, which means you are hungry. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mamerson, for the topics, for the speech.
The connection between the firms and the location. And the previous study said that all of the answers is negative and only one is positive. But in your paper said that three of them is positive and the other one is negative. My question is, on all of three results regarding the firm performance, is there any difference between on the third quadrant and the second quadrant, which is the connection between a strong firm
Yes.
and the unfavorable location,
Yes.
and weak firm on the favorable location? Is there any different, the result? Because both of them is positive.
For both of these quadrants, yeah, not the strong, not the weak, but the other two quadrants, for both of these quadrants, the shareholder value was positive and significant. And statistically, both of these quadrants were, there was no significant difference in the performance across these quadrants. This was significant and positive, this was significant and positive, and both of them were the same statistically, which gives even more support, I think, to the idea that there is an in-between. And just to follow up on that thing, one of the things, and I didn't mention this here, one of the things that I did was I did another study with a much larger data set, essentially replicating this study, which was based on emerging markets companies only, with a broader study that went everywhere, not just in emerging markets. That study also found the same results. That study also won several best paper awards. So you have two studies, two parallel studies. using different data, same theory, same methodology, different data, getting kudos from the Academy of Management, getting Academy of Management from Canada, getting kudos from Academy of International Business. So there were a lot of individual evaluators who thought that these studies, independent studies, and these evaluators didn't know each other because I had submitted them to very, very different conferences. Both of them thinking the same way, and the results are replicated. I had actually hired a statistician to check my work. Right? I knew what I was doing, but just to be on the safe side, I hired somebody who had a master's in applied statistics and who was doing a PhD in applied statistics, and I asked him to check my work. So yes, I'm very confident of the results, regardless of what the reviewer said, regardless of what the journal said, right? And you saw the results. I mean, it's very interesting. This is something that the CEOs would find very interesting, because if you were a CEO and you looked at the academic research, it would tell you that you have to be a strong firm going into a strong location. Most companies are not always strong. Most companies don't want to go to strong locations. They may have other choices. So if you went on the academic research, they would basically tell you that, listen, I mean, you step out of this first box, you are in trouble, and you are losing market share, market value. But if you do this other thing, then you have 3 ways to make money, 3 ways to improve your market value, instead of just one way which everybody knows, and you know that's really not telling you anything. Yeah? So something very different. Again, the question is, how do you feel? How do I feel after this paper has been published? Mixed reactions. You know, you see kudos on one hand, and then you don't see the publications on the other. I mean, that's just life.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
I liked what you said about, towards the end of your talk, about Asian ideas and Asian institutions. I think that is happening, in my opinion. You know, it's partly because of the incredible growth of China, Korea, and you know many of the other countries in Asia.
Yes.
I think there is a lot of soul searching. On one hand, what are the kind of institutions which should be developed when they don't exist? Mm-hmm. Should they borrow the institutions from the West, or should they design institutions of their own which would sustain and continue the growth in many cases? For example, you know, China, as you know, is still soul searching on what are the right kind of bankruptcy institutions. You know, how do you solve a breach of the debt contract? Mm-hmm. You know, things like that. Or you know, with all the state-owned companies, you know, do they need their own bankruptcy institutions, or should they take parts of the Western institutions? Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering, or deposit insurance, you know, there is a strong feeling that the regime would support the banking sector as it should be, mm-hmm. or should they design a Western style, you know, deposit insurance system, you know? Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether you've thought about what kind of institutions should they design on their own, and what kind of institutions probably they should adapt and modify, having borrowed from the West.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting question. The short answer is I don't know. And the reason I don't know is that I hope to God, and this is certainly not going to be the case for China, because China has its own mindset, They are thinking very carefully, very deeply, and in fact, China is, in my view, taking the best from the West and adding the Chinese characteristics that are rooted in the Chinese institutions. So they are doing a fabulous job. As to whether they should simply absorb the Western institutions or use Western institutions as a baseline, I think that's a very good question. The smart ones will use the Western institutions as a baseline, recognizing that China and India and Malaysia and Indonesia are not the same as United States. And US is very big in institutional development, as is UK and many other Western countries. But what happens in the West does not necessarily happen in what is not the West. And so if you end up putting a square in a hole, it's not going to fit, and then there is going to be nothing but frustration. And you see that frustration when they can't figure out how to do it. Well, maybe we should start with just a framework, saying here is the framework, this is what we are trying to achieve. And use that framework to import some of the good ideas from everywhere, not just the West, and then customize it in the local context. The problem with Asia is that we don't have much political stability, except for China. Right? And then every few years there is a new regime that comes in with its own agenda, which is not necessarily the agenda that you would have if you were guaranteed a position for 10 years. And that itself raises other questions, is whether a government should be in charge for 10 years. Right? But the short answer is yes. I mean, I think it would be very nice to take things from the West, use that as a foundation, and put on some non-Western characteristics to it. If we can do that rapidly enough, I see no reason why we should not have the same kind of expected performance that some of the Western economies are having. The irony is that with all these institutions, the Western economies are growing at 1.5% at best. And the Eastern economies with so-called broken institutions, as the West is calling it, are actually growing at 6% and 7%. So the guys with the institution are growing less, and the guys who we say have no institutions, or certainly not strong institutions, are actually doing fabulously. And this is a paradox. Is how do you explain that? That the guy who's playing by the rule actually loses. And the guy who's not playing by the rule consistently is growing faster than the guys who play by the rules. I mean, that's a research topic. How many politicians in this room, potential politicians, prime ministers, governors, CEOs of national institutions, please come and see me. You don't have to identify yourself. I will take you out to lunch. And we can have one very interesting conversation. But very, very interesting question. I wish I could give you a little more, but it's way beyond my scope. I have some ideas, of course, but way, way beyond my scope. Any other questions?
Okay, one last question. One last question.
They are hungry.
Okay, we captured that. Okay, because there is no question, so we have to end this session. Please give a round of applause for Professor Herman Mershan.
Thank you.
And for the interesting discussions. And we will also like to invite Dr. Herman Saherudin as the representative from Indonesia Deposit Insurance Corporation to give the token of appreciation to Professor Herman Mershan. Thank you so much, Professor Herman Mershen. You may go back to your seat. For all of partners and also sponsors who support today's conference, and all of participants who come and join this international conference. And before we end this session, I would like to give several informations. The first information, the Pearl Session 4 will be started at 12 promptly. So please, for all of presenters, please be ready 15 minutes before the session started in every parallel rooms. If you have a difficulties to find out the breakout rooms, you can ask the committee in front of the ballroom. They can find you the breakout rooms. And your lunch break, you can have your lunch break in Kunyit Resto, and it is ready to serve at 11:30. And also, the most important thing is we invite all of you, all of participants, to join the conference gala dinner that will be held in this ballroom at 6:30 p.m. So thank you so much. I hope that we have a better insight and understanding and experience a memorable conference in this international conference. On behalf of the committee, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
It's a pleasure to be here in this warm and beautiful country.
Known as a mega diversity country, we have 17,500 islands.
When the paper is accepted for publication, which now usually happens quickly.
And then this ties into the third part of the philosophy, which is this engagement idea.
Such as strong suppliers or even customers may force their interest into the business and ask them to adopt certain technologies.
And now the university complex is one of the most beautiful complex or campuses in the region.
The student will remember how you act rather than what you say. You have to become an actor rather than a lecturer.
The research funding from industry is somewhat limited, largely because an incubation center cannot be an episodical event. Big applause.
Bye.